On the morning of September 6, 1976, air traffic controllers in northern Japan watched an unknown fighter jet drop out of the clouds and line up for a civilian runway it had no business using. It was a Soviet MiG-25 Foxbat, one of the most feared aircraft on Earth, and the pilot who climbed out of it alone, armed and defecting, was about to force the Cold War to change direction in ways almost nobody predicted. The Cold War is usually told through the faces we already know: presidents at podiums, generals behind maps, intelligence chiefs in windowless rooms, but sometimes it pivots on a single person in a cockpit with a fuel gauge sinking toward empty and a decision that can't be reversed. Viktor Ivanovich Belenko was not a household name in the Soviet Union. He was not a celebrated ace, not a cosmonaut, not the kind of hero whose portrait was carried on banners at May Day parades. He was an ordinary Soviet military pilot until he wasn't. The irony is that the West spent years obsessing over the MiG-25, building strategy around what it thought the aircraft could do, while hardly anybody outside a narrow circle knew the name of the man who would hand the Foxbat secrets over to the United States in broad daylight. To understand why one pilot's flight to Japan mattered so much, you have to feel the mood of the mid-1970s, the brittle calm of détente, the public language of peace layered over private suspicion. In Washington and Moscow, leaders smiled for cameras and signed documents while intelligence services measured each other's breathing. The United States and the Soviet Union had agreed to the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. One was signed in May 1972, and in 1975, the Helsinki Final Act promised a new era of European security and cooperation. But treaties did not erase the central terror of the era: the fear that one side might suddenly gain a decisive technological edge, the kind that could make the other side's defenses obsolete in a weekend. And in those years, few objects fed that fear like a grey Soviet interceptor that Western analysts could barely see and could not touch. The MiG-25 first broke into Western consciousness in 1967, when the Soviet Union displayed it publicly at the Domodedovo Air Show near Moscow. Western observers saw a huge, angular aircraft bigger than expected, seemingly built for extreme speed and altitude. The Foxbat's performance envelopes, pieced together from sparse sightings and radar tracks, looked like something from a future war: Mach 2.8 plus, perhaps Mach 3, extreme altitude, a radar that might pick up targets far beyond what NATO expected, missiles that could threaten American bombers before they ever approached Soviet airspace. At the height of Cold War imagination, the MiG-25 became not merely an aircraft, but a question mark with wings. What if it could catch and kill high-flying reconnaissance aircraft? What if it could challenge the best American fighters? What if it could intercept the B-70 Valkyrian American bomber program that was later cancelled, or threaten the SR-71 Blackbird, whose very survival depended on speed and altitude? The United States could not afford to be wrong in the optimistic direction. If you assumed the Foxbat was limited, and you were mistaken, your pilots died, your bombers died, your early warning assumptions died with them. In intelligence work, caution is not just a habit. It's insurance. This is where the MiG-25's shadow begins to shape real history. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the United States committed to building the F-15 Eagle, a fighter designed to dominate the air against advanced Soviet threats. The F-15's development was influenced by the perceived need to counter aircraft like the MiG-25. The Foxbat, in other words, was so intimidating on paper that it helped drive American procurement decisions worth billions of dollars and shaped NATO air doctrine for years. All of that happened before the West had ever examined a MiG-25 up close. In the Soviet Union, meanwhile, the Foxbat was a tool built for a particular kind of war, the nightmare scenario Soviet planners never stopped rehearsing. American strategic bombers, possibly carrying nuclear weapons, racing toward Soviet cities across the Arctic routes. High-altitude intruders like the U-2 in the late 1950s, or the SR-71 later, humiliating Soviet air defenses by flying where interceptors couldn't reach. The Soviet response was layered. Radar networks, surface-to-air missile systems, and interceptors like the MiG-25P fielded to the PVO Strany. The Soviet Air Defense Force is an enormous organization, separate from the regular Air Force, tasked with guarding Soviet airspace like a permanent high-alert wall. The MiG-25 was not a sleek dogfighter built for turning battles over Central Europe. It was a brute built to climb fast, sprint fast, and launch heavy missiles at high-value intruders. It used powerful Tumansky R-15 engines that could push it to extreme speed at the cost of engine life if run too hard. It used stainless steel and nickel alloys extensively, not lightweight titanium like the American SR-71, partly due to Soviet industrial choices and constraints. It carried a large radar and heavy weapons. It was, in a sense, a flying alarm bell. Get up there, get in front, and force the intruder to turn away or die. And Viktor Belenko was one of the men trusted to fly it. Belenko was born in 1947 in the Soviet Union, still recovering from the devastation of World War II. This matters because the post-war Soviet experience wasn't simply about ideology. It was about shortages, crowded apartments, rationed dreams, and an enormous state that demanded loyalty while often failing to deliver dignity. By the 1960s and 1970s, Soviet citizens were promised stability and progress, but daily life could feel like a constant negotiation with scarcity and bureaucracy. In a military career especially, as a pilot there was status, access and pride. There was also pressure, political supervision, and the knowledge that your life belonged to the state. Belenko trained as a pilot and eventually flew for Soviet air defenses. He was stationed in the Far East at Zhugaevka Air Base in Primorsky Krai, not far from Vladivostok and the Pacific. The geography mattered. This was the edge of the Soviet map facing Japan, South Korea, and US forces in the Pacific. It was a place of fog, long distances, and the quiet tension of radar screens that never slept. The airmen there lived with the sense that if war came, it might come without warning. A blip, an alarm, a scramble, and then whatever the next minutes decided for their country. But while the Cold War often looks like two giant machines grinding against each other, inside those machines were human beings with private disappointments. In documented accounts from Belenko after his defection, he described dissatisfaction with Soviet life and the system. Whatever mix of ideology, personal frustration, ambition, or desperation drove him, the result was the same. He began to contemplate the one act the Soviet system feared most, because it turned a citizen into a weapon for the enemy. Defection. Defection from the Soviet Union was not simply leaving your job. It was a betrayal stamped with the full weight of the state. It meant your family and friends could suffer consequences. It meant you were gambling your life on the assumption that the other side would not hand you back. And for a military pilot, it meant betraying not only your country, but the technology and tactics the country guarded obsessively. In the Soviet military, especially in sensitive units like air defense, security was layered. Pilots were watched, bases were controlled, flights were planned, and yet, in the routine of training and the sheer scale of the Soviet armed forces, cracks existed. A man who could sit in a cockpit with a full fuel load and a functioning navigation system had, in that moment, an extraordinary form of leverage. He could decide where the aircraft went. On September 6, 1976, Belenko took off on what was supposed to be a routine training flight in a MiG-25P. The day's conditions and exact planning details have been discussed in various accounts, but what is not in dispute is the outcome. The aircraft did not return as expected. Soviet controllers lost track of it, and within a short time Belenko was flying toward Japan. Imagine the sensory experience of that flight. The cockpit of a Foxbat is not a romantic place. It is metal and glass, instrumentation, the constant mechanical texture of a machine built for speed rather than comfort. There is the vibration of powerful engines and the knowledge that pushing them too far could destroy them. There is the heavy pressure of oxygen equipment at altitude, the narrow view through a fighter canopy, the constant need to check bearings, fuel, altitude, and beneath it all, a louder noise than the engines, the reality that every kilometer traveled away from Soviet airspace increased the chance that Soviet interceptors or surface-to-air missiles might be sent to bring him down. Belenko flew low to reduce the chance of being tracked by radar, hugging the terrain and sea where possible. Flying low in a high-performance jet is physically demanding and dangerous. The margin for error shrinks. A moment's misjudgment can put you into the water. But low flight offered a kind of concealment in the clutter of ground returns. In Cold War air defense, radar was powerful, but it wasn't magic. There is also an uncomfortable truth about the Soviet system. It had built a huge, formidable air defense network, but it was still a human system. People hesitated, people miscommunicated. Procedures could be rigid, and rigid procedures can fail when something unexpected happens. A pilot defecting in the Far East in a top-secret interceptor was not an everyday situation. As Belenko crossed toward Japan, his fuel situation worsened. This is where the story tightens like a fist. A defection plan that works in theory can collapse in the last minutes for a simple reason. The aircraft does not have the range you wish it did, or weather forces you off course, or you miscalculate the navigation. You do not get to pull over and ask directions. You do not get to call a friend. By early afternoon local time, Japanese radar detected the intruding aircraft. Japanese air defense scrambled fighters F-4 Phantoms from the Japan Air Self-Defense Force. But the MiG-25 was already descending and maneuvering toward an airfield. Belenko aimed for Hakodate Airport on the island of Hokkaido, a civilian airport not built for Soviet interceptors making emergency landings. His choice was partly dictated by fuel. He needed a runway. He needed it immediately. The landing itself became one of the most dramatic non-combat landings of the Cold War. A MiG-25 was not designed for short, improvised landings at a civilian field with airliners and ground vehicles. Belenko came in fast. He overshot. Reports describe him rolling beyond the runway and onto a grassy area before stopping. The jet's presence, its size, its foreign markings, the raw fact of it was like a crack in reality for the people who saw it. In the middle of ordinary airport routines, luggage carts, passenger announcements, the mundane rhythm of civilian travel, a weapon from the Soviet Union had arrived, uninvited. And then there was the pilot. Belenko emerged and fired warning shots into the air to keep people back, according to contemporary reporting, trying to secure the aircraft and his own position until authorities arrived. This was not a cinematic flourish. It was a man who understood that in the first moments everything was uncertain. Would Japan treat him as a criminal? Would the Soviets send agents? Would a panicked guard shoot him? Would anyone rush the aircraft and damage it or seize him? Japan detained Belenko. The government faced an immediate diplomatic crisis. Japan was a U.S. ally under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, but it also maintained a complex relationship with the Soviet Union, including unresolved territorial disputes over the Kuril Islands, Northern Territories. Now a Soviet pilot and one of the Soviet Union's most secret aircraft sat on Japanese soil, and the whole world would soon know. Moscow's reaction was swift and furious. The Soviet government demanded the immediate return of both the pilot and the aircraft, framing the incident in terms that avoided the humiliating word defection. In Soviet public statements, there were claims that the pilot had been forced to land, or that the aircraft had suffered technical problems. The Soviets protested what they called violations of international law. But behind the formal language was panic of a particular kind, the fear that the United States would get what it had been chasing for nearly a decade, the chance to inspect the Foxbat not through grainy photos or radar plots, but by unscrewing its panels and reading its systems like a book. Japan, caught between superpowers, had to tread carefully. The aircraft was on its territory, and Japanese authorities had to manage safety, sovereignty, and alliance politics simultaneously. They also had to manage practical realities. Hakodate Airport was not a secure military base. The MiG-25 had landed in a place where civilians could see it, photograph it, and talk about it. Within days, the United States moved quickly. American specialists were given access to the aircraft. The examination of Belenka's MiG-25 became one of the most valuable intelligence windfalls of the Cold War. This was not a rumor or a legend. It is a documented event. The MiG-25 was taken apart for inspection in Japan before being returned to the Soviet Union in pieces. Here the story takes a turn that is both technical and deeply human, because what the West found inside the Foxbat was not what many had expected. The Foxbat had been feared as a kind of Soviet superplane, possibly built with advanced materials and sophisticated electronics. Instead, when American and Japanese experts examined it, they discovered a machine designed with a different logic, strong, fast in a straight line, optimized for interception, but not the technological miracles some had imagined. The airframe used large amounts of stainless steel rather than titanium. Its electronics relied heavily on vacuum tubes in certain systems rather than the most modern solid-state components the West assumed would be necessary. This wasn't because Soviet engineers were ignorant. Vacuum tubes can be more resistant to certain electromagnetic effects, and Soviet industry made trade-offs based on what it could produce reliably at scale. The MiG-25 was a product of an industrial ecosystem, not just a design bureau's dreams. The implications were enormous. For years, the West had been worried not only about the MiG-25's speed, but about what it symbolized, that Soviet aerospace engineering might be leaping ahead in areas the US couldn't see. Now the symbol cracked. The Foxbat was formidable in its role, but it was not the all-purpose air superiority monster some intelligence estimates had implied. That revelation did not make the Soviet Union harmless. It did something subtler and, in Cold War terms, potentially more dangerous. It corrected Western assumptions. It helped the United States and its allies understand what the Soviet Union was actually building and why. It also gave insight into Soviet radar, missile integration, avionics philosophy, and maintenance realities. Insight that could be turned into tactics, countermeasures, and design decisions. And it also rewrote a key psychological equation. Fear based on uncertainty is different from fear based on knowledge. Uncertainty can cause overreaction. Knowledge can lead to confidence, and confidence can change policy. One of the most ironic consequences is that the United States had already poured resources into countering the Foxbat, including accelerating programs like the F-15. Belenko's defection did not undo those decisions, but it helped validate some judgments while deflating others. The West learned that the MiG-25 was not primarily a dogfighter, and that its agility limitations meant it wasn't the one-to-one counterpart of an American air superiority fighter. That mattered for pilot training, for threat modeling, for how NATO imagined the first days of a war in Europe. At the same time, the defection confirmed the seriousness of Soviet air defense priorities. The MiG-25's radar and missile systems were built for the mission they were intended to perform. The Foxbat was a specialized weapon aimed at a specific American advantage: high-altitude penetration and reconnaissance. Even if it wasn't a graceful fighter, it was a threat in the role it was made for. While the technicians worked, the political pressure intensified. The Soviet Union demanded its property back. Japan insisted on its legal processes. The United States, always careful about appearances, had to avoid looking like it had staged the defection, while also making full use of the intelligence opportunity it had been handed. Belenko himself became a human intelligence prize. He was debriefed extensively by American intelligence. A pilot is not just a driver. He is a living archive of procedures, readiness levels, base life, training standards, morale, and the thousand tiny details that never appear in technical manuals. A pilot can explain how often aircraft actually fly, how maintenance is really done, how strict commanders are, how political officers behave, what scares people, what people joke about, what people whisper in hallways when they think nobody is listening. In the Cold War, those details were strategic. It is difficult today to feel how intimate that knowledge could be. The Soviet Union was a closed society with layers of secrecy. Western analysts built models from satellite images and intercepted signals, but the inner texture of military life remained hard to capture. A defector from an elite air defense unit could confirm or challenge assumptions with a simple statement: yes, we practice this; no, we don't do that; this is how long it takes; this is what breaks; this is what commanders fear; this is what they pretend not to fear. And now the Soviet Union had to respond. Inside the USSR, Belenko's defection was more than a security breach. It was a humiliation. It suggested that a trusted pilot could decide to leave, not under fire, not in the chaos of war, but during a training flight. It meant that loyalty so central to Soviet ideology and control could not be assumed even in a unit tasked with defending the homeland. The Soviet response reportedly included tightening security, reviewing procedures, and punishing or investigating those associated with the incident. In systems built on control, a breach often triggers a wave of suspicion. Who helped him? Who noticed something and didn't report it? Who failed to stop him? Even if Belenko acted alone, bureaucracies under stress often behave as if conspiracies are more comforting than randomness, because conspiracies can be fought with purges and paperwork. Meanwhile, Japan had to return the aircraft. It did so, but not before it had been examined. The MiG-25 was ultimately returned to the Soviet Union in crates in November 1976, disassembled. That fact alone is a symbol of Cold War reality. Superpowers could demand property back, but they could not demand that the other side unsee what it had already seen. The Soviet Union, now aware that the Foxbat's internals had been exposed, faced the cost of compromise. In military technology, secrecy is not only about pride, it is about survivability. If your adversary understands your radar frequencies, your electronic countermeasures, your missile guidance logic, your weaknesses, then your systems may have to be modified, upgraded, or replaced. That costs money, time, and industrial effort. In the 1970s, the Soviet economy was already showing structural problems that would grow more severe in the coming decade. The state could still marshal enormous resources, but it could not do everything easily, and it could not do it without trade-offs. Belenko's defection contributed to those trade-offs. It is associated with Soviet efforts to improve or alter certain systems and, more broadly, with the recognition that the West now had a clearer picture of a major component of Soviet air defense. The MiG-25 itself continued to serve in various roles, and derivatives and successors like the MiG-31 Foxhound would carry forward the concept of long-range, high-speed interception with more advanced avionics. The Soviet Union did not stop building interceptors, but the world in which it built them had changed. Secrecy had been punctured. In the West, the Foxbat's exposure had a second-order effect. It improved the accuracy of intelligence analysis. This is less cinematic than a spy chase, but it is arguably more powerful. The Cold War was full of worst-case assumptions. Sometimes worst cases were prudent. Sometimes they were distortions that fueled arms races beyond what was necessary. Every time a major unknown becomes known, decision-makers adjust, budgets adjust, threat briefings adjust, negotiation positions adjust. And that is how a single pilot can change the Cold War without firing a shot. Because what really shifts in this story is not territory or treaty text, it is perception. Consider what the MiG-25 represented before 1976. It was a fast-moving mystery that generated anxiety and, in the United States, helped justify major investments. After 1976, it became a measurable system with identifiable strengths and weaknesses. The United States could plan with more precision. Precision reduces panic. It also reduces the likelihood of catastrophic miscalculation born of exaggerated myths. But here comes the darker irony. Reducing one kind of miscalculation can enable another. If you believe you understand the opponent's system well, you may be tempted to take risks you would avoid under uncertainty. Confidence can stabilize, but it can also provoke. In deterrence theory, both fear and confidence can produce dangerous behavior under the wrong conditions. Belenko's act also carried a human lesson that cut through Cold War stereotypes. Western propaganda often portrayed Soviet citizens as uniformly controlled, uniformly loyal, uniformly boxed in by ideology. Yet here was a man raised and trained inside that system, flying a prized aircraft, deciding to leave. For Soviet leaders, it was a reminder that control was never total. For Western audiences, it was evidence that the Soviet Union's legitimacy problems were not merely theoretical. Belenko eventually settled in the United States and became an American citizen in 1980. His memoir, MiG Pilot, published in 1980, offered his perspective on Soviet life and his decision. Over time, the immediate shock of the defection faded into the long archive of Cold War incidents, and his name became less familiar than the aircraft he brought with him. The Foxbat remained a symbol in aviation history. The pilot became, in a sense, a footnote, but the magnitude of what he did remains. Think about the Cold War as a contest not only of weapons, but of information. The Soviet Union and the United States each built vast intelligence systems, from satellites to spies to signals intercept networks. They competed to know what the other side was building, what it could do, and what it intended. Sometimes that competition prevented war by clarifying intentions. Sometimes it fueled war scares by revealing capabilities in the most alarming light. The defection of a pilot with a top-secret aircraft was an intelligence coup of rare purity. It was not an intercepted message that might be misread, not a satellite photo that might be misinterpreted, not an agent's report that might be colored by fear or ambition. It was hardware. It was reality sitting on a runway, and reality has weight. The day Belenko landed at Hakodate, he forced two governments, Japan and the Soviet Union, into a diplomatic collision. He forced the United States into a rapid exploitation effort. He forced Soviet planners to assume the worst about what had been compromised. He forced Western planners to revise assumptions that had been driving procurement and tactics. He forced a global audience to confront, if only briefly, the fact that the Cold War was not only happening in negotiating rooms, but in the personal calculations of individuals whose names would never appear in treaties. There is also a kind of grim poetry in where it happened. Hokkaido is close enough to Russia that the air can feel like a shared substance. Fog and sea winds blur the line between continents. A Soviet interceptor landing there was not only a political event, it was a geographical one, a reminder that the Cold War's front lines were often not walls, but distances, short distances, that aircraft could cross in minutes. So did Viktor Belenko change the Cold War in the way a president signing a treaty changes it? Not in the direct headline sense, but in the Cold War, small shifts in knowledge could ripple outward into doctrine, spending, confidence, and crisis stability. And what might have happened if he had not made it? If Belenko had run out of fuel and ditched into the sea, the West would have had a tragedy, not a treasure. If Soviet interceptors had found him and forced him down, the Soviet Union might have turned his attempt into a warning tale rather than a humiliation. If Japan had immediately returned the aircraft untouched, American experts might have waited years longer for a similar opportunity, if it ever came. In that alternate history, Western perceptions of the MiG-25 might have remained inflated, shaping spending and strategy through the late 1970s and into the 1980s with a different emotional charge. Instead, the West got clarity in 1976, at a time when the Cold War was entering a new phase. Within a few years, they turned would give way to renewed tensions, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, the NATO decision on Pershing II and cruise missiles, the hardening rhetoric of the early Reagan years, and a series of frightening moments that tested nuclear stability. In that environment, accurate understanding of adversary capabilities was not a luxury, it was a safety factor. It would be an exaggeration to claim that Belenko's defection prevented a war. History rarely offers such clean cause and effect, but it is historically grounded to say that his act altered the information landscape in which Cold War decisions were made. It changed the West's assessment of a high-profile Soviet weapons system. It imposed costs and reforms on Soviet security. It provided intelligence on Soviet air defense operations and culture. And it became a reference point in the long struggle between secrecy and exposure that defined the era. The story also carries a quieter, more unsettling point. The Cold War was often discussed as if it were a chess match between two grandmasters, each calculating, each in control. But Belenko's flight suggests something different. The board was crowded with pieces that could move themselves. A pilot with doubts could become a strategic event. A fuel calculation could become an international crisis. A runway in a civilian airport could become the scene of one of the most consequential intelligence coups of the decade. In the end, Viktor Belenko did not change the Cold War by outmaneuvering an enemy in the sky. He changed it by revealing what was inside the machine, by turning a myth into an object that could be measured, photographed, catalogued, and countered. And that is a kind of power that still matters. Because even now, long after the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin in December 1991, the logic of his story remains modern. Nations still guard their secrets. Militaries still rely on uncertainty to deter rivals. Intelligence agencies still chase the difference between what an adversary claims and what it can actually do. And individuals inside closed systems still face moments when personal conviction collides with state control. The Cold War was not only a contest of ideologies, it was a contest over reality, over who could define it, who could hide it, and who could expose it. On a cloudy day in 1976, a forgotten Soviet pilot landed a Foxbat on a Japanese runway and reminded the world that history sometimes turns not on speeches or summits, but on the trembling line between fear and knowledge, drawn at 500 knots with fuel running out.